Hey guys, today's video is going to be a little different. To jump straight to the editing tutorial, skip to this timestamp. I went to a location called Roxborough State Park here in Colorado for a bang bang, which is a sunset and sunrise, and, well, I was screwed over by gosh. I got flat light for both. I did have a ton of fun hanging out with the mosquitoes though, so hopefully I don't bleed out on the trail from getting stabbed. I mean, that's what it is. It's violence is what it is. They're stabbing people, and I've been stabbed. I mean, I'm a victim. I only really walked away with a couple of images, so I figured instead of deleting this whole video and quietly weeping while sucking on a pacifier, I'd instead try to teach you guys some stuff, which basically makes me a professor. In fact, I'd go so far as to say I'm the only YouTuber you can trust. All those other guys, they make their videos, sure, but where do they go afterwards? They disappear. How do we even know they exist? When I shut off the camera, I'm still here. I promise you that. We're gonna go through a whole editing process in Photoshop. We're gonna do some dodging and burning with luminosity masks, and some color work, as well as some other localized adjustments to really breathe life into these flat photos. As I'm sure you know, the worse the conditions, the more work you're gonna have to do in post to create a striking image. So let's jump into it. So we're gonna spend the most time with this photo. It's important to note that you still need to be paying attention to available light and of course composition. This photo as is incredibly boring, but since I shot this with the intent of doing a very heavy edit, we have this foreground that has light hitting it, as well as the rocks in the background, and as you'll notice, we still have some directionality to the light. This is all going to be about emphasizing and coercing the light that we have. You'll notice we have this warm spot up here in the sky, so this is where our main light source is going to be coming from. Now this photo is already completed, but I left all these layers intact, so we can go through them one at a time, as well as the thought process behind them, but I'm going to break this video into chapters as best I can for any future reference. So let's go through and turn all these layers on one at a time to get a general understanding of what I did here. So we started with a foreground, dodge and burn, which is lightening of the lighter areas and darkening of the darker areas. I did this with just a foreground selection, so the sky was not affected. And then we have a foreground and sky sort of color dodge and burn here. We added a little bit of color to some of these areas. And then what I did was I combined out these layers, and I'm gonna go through all of this later, but we combined out these layers and opened Adobe Camera Raw and did some color adjustments, as well as added a little bit of glow to the sky up here, so already it's starting to look quite different. And then we added a little bit more dodging and burning to these rocks and a little bit of shadows behind them. We did a little bit of sky edits, darkening down the clouds in the sky for a little more contrast. And then a little bit more colors. And some of this is just sort of, as I saw fit, I would just add another layer and do a few more things to it. I just try to leave all these layers intact so I can go back if I need to. And then we combined them out again to this layer. And then we did a sharpening layer here. We can zoom in and take a look at the difference. And then again, we combined them out to this, and I did a little bit of cleanup down here, just removing some stray garbage that would add distractions. And then we combined that out again, and then we made a Orton Glow, which is this soft, subtle glow in the highlights of the frame. So that's all we did. So I'm gonna go ahead and hide all these layers, and let's pretend like they're not here. My little area down here is gonna look different for you if you're following along, but just keep in mind that right now, this is all we have is this base layer. I would completely start over from scratch and make a whole new edit, but it sometimes takes me forever to edit photos, even with some of the time-saving tools that I'm going to show you. And I think this can get across all the steps without starting from scratch. Plus, I have my AC off for recording, and I really don't want to sweat my taint apart any longer than I absolutely have to. So again, let's pretend like none of these are here. We're going to start from here. So generally speaking, after making any minor exposure and white balance adjustments that are needed in Lightroom, and in between aggressively scratching and screaming at the mosquito bites I received while taking the photo, the first thing I do after opening to Photoshop is to start some dodge and burn layers. There is a dodge and burn function in Photoshop over here somewhere, but I like the old school way of doing things, which is to go up to Layer, New, Layer. This is our blend mode. We're going to switch to Overlay, and fill with an overlay neutral color, which is 50% gray. That doesn't actually change the way it looks, but it makes a gray layer down here. As you can see on these other ones, we'll actually be able to see our edits in real time. That's really the only reason that I do that. So the general idea between dodging and burning is to emphasize the light areas, or dodge, and emphasize the dark areas, or burn. So we're gonna start this layer with just the foreground, dodging and burning. So I'm just gonna name this FG for foreground, DB for dodge and burn 1. And since we're gonna be doing a very heavy edit, this is the most important part, so pay attention if you have never done this before. Now you could start right now. You could grab your brush up here. You could change your opacity and flow to 100% or whatever, and just start brightening whatever you want. But we're actually going to be adding another tool called luminosity masks. Maybe you've heard of it or even tried to use them before, but luminosity masks are a way to create a Photoshop selection based on luminance values that are present in your photo. It sounds complicated, but it's actually incredibly simple once you get the hang of it. I use Easy Panel. It's free and very easy to use. I'll put a link in the description, but once you install that, you're gonna go up to Plugins, Easy Panel, and just make sure that this is checked, and then you can move it wherever you want. I keep mine right here because I use it pretty much every day. Luminosity masks will make your life much easier if you use them correctly. But the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna get a sky selection saved. We're gonna go up to Select, Sky, and Photoshop usually does a pretty good job of selecting the sky, but now in Photoshop we have this little pop-up here. We can click this and select and mask. If you have any areas where there are trees poking out over your horizon, it's a good idea to just run this brush over them just to kind of refine the selection a little bit. It's not always necessary, and you still want to be careful. You don't want to overuse this because I've seen it do some really weird things. I don't have 100% way nailed down to using select and mask, so maybe you can look up some tutorials on YouTube of how to use this a little bit better if you do have some problem areas that are just not selecting properly. But usually you can kind of solve it with the opacity up here and playing with some of these other settings, so just mess around with it. But usually it's not super necessary. So we're just gonna hit OK to finalize that. Now we have a decent sky selection, and we're gonna make sure that we save this. So go up to Select, Save Selection. I'm just gonna call it Sky 1. And now, even if we deselect, we can always revert back to this selection if we made a mistake or something. So with our sky selected, we want the foreground though. So we're gonna go back up to Select and just hit Inverse. That's just gonna flip it. So now we just have our foreground selected. And now we can combine this foreground selection with a luminosity mask. So now watch what happens when we do this. We're gonna go up to our Easy Panel and hit this Bright LMs. It's gonna create a folder down here, but don't worry too much about that. We're gonna try 1, 2. As you can see, it turns everything to black and white, but white means selected and black means not selected. So this is actually selecting the brighter parts of the image. Feel free to cycle through them to see what works best for you. On mine here, 2 is even too aggressive, so it's just not selecting enough of these highlights. So I'm just gonna stick with 1, but feel free to play with them because you're not actually doing anything until you hit Make Selection here, which is what I'm gonna do now. Now if we zoom in, we can see Photoshop doesn't do a very good job of communicating exactly what's selected. So it looks like just very small parts of the image are selected, but this is actually a more analog selection where the bright parts of our foreground are selected and the selection gets less intense the darker the pixels get. So don't forget, you can always save any selection you have. So if you accidentally deselect, you can easily redo it. But these little selection lines are here and they're annoying, so we're just gonna hit Control H to hide them. We still have a selection active though. So now let's make sure we hit B for brush and make sure that we select our gray dodge burn layer down here. And over here on our brush color, we have white and black. So white is brighten, and then if we hit X or click this little button right here, we can switch it to black for darken. So since we're gonna start with our brights, we're just gonna bring our brush size down by left clicking and dragging this around. We're actually gonna turn our hardness up a little bit too, to about 40. I usually keep it right around there. And then our opacity, I'm gonna bring down to 15 and flow to 15 as well. You could go higher and you could just make quick work of it, but I like to just go a little bit more slowly, and I like to do lots of brush strokes to really make sure that the brightness is only going where I want it. I'm not gonna do this whole process. As I said, I already did all this, but you know, just sort of go until it starts to look a little bit better to you. You know, you obviously don't want to go too far. You don't want to make the foreground pure white because that's just not realistic, right? And that's why I usually have a pretty low opacity so I can turn this on and off and actually see what I'm doing to it in real time. And as soon as it starts to look unrealistic, maybe it's time to dial it back a little bit or even just start over. And you can always change the opacity of this too if you did go too far, so you can bring down the intensity of it. The next thing we would do after these highlights is for some darkening. And both of these really just depend on your composition. Like, see, mine has this sort of S shape here that I want to accentuate. So I want the brighter areas to follow this line and up into the sky and across these rocks to have a nice area for our eyes to follow. And what we're going to do with our darks is we're going to kind of just darken down the areas that we don't want our eyes to follow. Now remember, we still have our brights luminosity mask selected, so we're going to hit Control H again to show it back up, and then we're going to hit Control D to deselect. Now that's going to deselect our foreground too, and since we want to focus on our foreground darks, we're going to load the sky. Sky 1, and we're going to invert it again for foreground. And now we're just going to do the same thing, but for darks. We're going to hit Dark LMs. We're going to try to see how these look. Now my foreground is fairly dark already, and it's pretty flat, so this isn't a very aggressive selection. So we might want to go 2, or honestly even 3 on this one. And again, remember, white means selected, black means less selected. So this looks like a pretty good one. So we're going to make selection. Again, very ugly, so Control H to hide all that. And we're just going to flip this by hitting X or clicking here. I usually use about the same opacity and flow, about the same hardness. And we're just going to go through and do the same, but where we want shadows. So maybe some down here. Maybe we're going to darken up this area over here. Lots of brush strokes, lots of quick brush strokes. Just anywhere that we don't want the eye to go. But again, make sure that it's only where shadow would naturally fall. Like behind these rocks up here, to the left of all these plants, stuff like that. So let's assume I just did all that, and now we have this. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this random one because I didn't actually do anything with it. But as you can tell, it's already making quite a big difference here. Now the cool thing about using this gray layer down here is if we turn off our base layer, we can actually see exactly where these brush strokes are going. And this is the glory of luminosity masks, is that we can just run a brush over this area and it's only going to realistically paint where we want our lightning to go. You can actually see the texture in the rocks on these brush strokes without actually having to zoom into the pixel level and brighten little tiny individual areas. It makes it look better, and it's much faster. And it also just sort of eliminates the possibility of mistakes by accidentally brightening darker areas because they're not selected. So now that we have an initial dodge and burn done, we're gonna do kind of the same thing, but we're just gonna be brightening with color in certain areas. So for now, I'm gonna Control H to re-show our selection here, and then hit Control D to deselect. Now this time I'm going to be doing some heavy-handed dodging, which is brightening, but with color, and I'm not going to use any selections. So we're actually going to do sort of a global selection brightening of this sky area over here with color. So we're going to create, again, another dodge and burn layer. Overlay, neutral gray. And now we're going to flip this by hitting X or clicking here to white, and we're actually going to take our eyedropper here and we're going to find a color in our image that we want to put somewhere else. So we're going to drop this orange over here in the sky because this is where our light is going to be coming from, so it's going to look more realistic if we actually use this real color. But I'm going to grab this and bring it up a little bit. It almost looks pure white, but it does have some color in there. And if this box isn't here for you, you can always click your square down here and it'll bring up a similar box here. So almost pure white, but into the color a little bit. We're going to go back to our brush. We're going to bring the hardness down now and bring maybe the size up a little bit. That looks good. But we're going to bring our opacity all the way up to somewhere between 40 and 50. And then we're just going to tap over here a few times. And, you know, feel free to make it smaller and get right along the horizon. Very important not to go too crazy with this, but the key is to emphasize, not necessarily to create a light source. But we're just gonna, you know, add some nice softening to it. And we could even come down a little bit and do some strokes, quick strokes down into our foreground. But as always, just be very careful. So I'm gonna delete this again. But let's assume I did it and we have this. So I did a similar thing in the sky, just quick brush strokes. And with a nice soft brush, very easy to go overboard. So again, always make sure that you're turning it on and off to make sure it actually looks good to your eye. So as you can see now, our light source is really starting to shine. It's starting to become a much more engaging photo. So now that we have a few layers starting to build up here, we're going to take the next step, which is some color work. So by selecting your top layer here and hitting Control-Shift-Alt-E, it's going to create a new layer with all of your previous visible layers combined into one. So now we can turn off all these and we have our combined layer just sitting here. So our next step is going to be some color work, and you can see my color work that I did before. It's starting to look quite different. I pulled some saturation back. I added a little bit more glow to the sky here. So the way that I like to do this is by just literally going up to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, which is basically Lightroom within Photoshop. And you can start playing with colors. You know, maybe try pulling saturation back a little bit, which is what I did in this one. You know, oftentimes you might want to pull your yellows over to orange, or maybe even pull your greens over to yellows. Try desaturating as well as increasing saturation. I think a lot of people increase saturation automatically because I think that just makes for a more vibrant photo, but for some reason desaturating often has just as striking results depending on the colors that you're desaturating. I often will pull my blues over to aqua just a little bit, desaturate, and bring down a little bit of the luminance to sort of bring some drama into the sky. It really just kind of depends on the colors that are present in your photo. But another very important step is going to be color grading, and I think in this one I brought my highlights over to the orange a little bit, my mid-tones to a more red. Maybe try experimenting with darkening that down. It really, again, just kind of depends on the colors you have in your photo and the feel you're going for. You know, if you took a photo of a very cold, snowy scene, you might want to experiment with a little bit of blue in the shadows and highlights. If it's a nice sunset you're trying to go after, a little bit of orange and reds in your highlights and maybe even shadows. So, but once you sort of have the colors where you like them, we're going to grab a radial gradient and we're going to throw it right over our light source in the sky here. And we're going to do negative dehaze and a little bit of negative clarity. Be very careful with both these, positive or negative. You can really screw up your photo if you fuck with them too much. Negative dehaze and negative clarity adds a nice little glow to your light source here, and then we can sort of bring up the whites to compensate because those often will flatten your whites out. So once you're done with that, go ahead and hit OK. I'm going to hit cancel because, again, I already did this. So this is my post Adobe Camera Raw color work. I like to use Adobe Camera Raw because it feels like Lightroom and it's very easy and quick to go through and do these things. It is destructive, but again, that's why I save all these previous layers. So if I do screw this up, I can always go back and recombine these out and then try again. It just works for my workflow. Maybe it won't for yours, but now these next few layers aren't really rules I follow, but it's sort of just like, oh, you know, I've been working on this. I've been staring at it for a while. Maybe I think I kind of want to brighten these rocks up a little bit. So I'll do a foreground again, luminosity mask, and I'll brighten up the rocks a little bit, maybe darken down behind it just to add a little bit more drama and a little bit more intensity. We did the same thing but with the sky and darks by running a brush very quickly and softly over our dark clouds. It's very easy to make those look bad, so be careful with that. But by doing a sky selection and a dark LMs, it's a lot easier to not screw that up. So we darkened that down a little bit. We did even more glow over here with a little bit of color just to sort of emphasize that even further. And as you can see, it's really starting to come together now. Once you get to a point to where you're pretty happy with the way it's looking and you want to take the next step, again, select your top layer, Control-Shift-Alt-E, and that'll combine it out to a new layer, and you can turn off everything below it. So the next step we're going to do here, now that we are happy with the way everything is looking and the colors and the brightness and all that looks good, we're going to do a little bit of sharpening. So by duplicating this layer, our combined out layer here, right click and duplicate. We're going to have two identicals here. So on this top one, we're going to go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. And I usually leave this between 2.5 and 3, 3.2, whatever. Nothing crazy, but nothing too low. And after we hit OK, we can see this looks awful. But what it's doing is it's sort of applying little lines and stuff to the edges in the frame, which looks terrible. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a layer mask, and that is this button right here. If you're not sure what a layer mask is, it's basically a layer that will link to any other layer, and it'll allow us to dictate what we want to be visible of this original layer, if that makes sense. Now, white means show, black means hide. So when this layer mask is white, it means all of this layer will be visible. And we don't want to apply our sharpening globally, but just on the foreground, because sharpening looks like AIDS in the sky. So this layer mask will allow us to paint where we want our sharpening. So right now the layer mask is white. So by clicking our layer mask and hitting Control I, it's going to flip that to black, which means this new sharpening layer is no longer visible. So now what we can do, taking what we learned with our brush and our luminosity masks, is by using our brush again, making sure this is white, because we're going to be painting white in on this layer mask. And this is all while the layer mask is selected. But we're going to go up to our opacity and flow, put these to 100%, and we're just basically going to start painting in where we want our sharpening. And the way that I do it is just in the foreground, because again, sharpening in the sky looks like AIDS. I also tend to avoid the actual spot where the sky touches the foreground. I guess you would call that a horizon. I don't know what's wrong with my brain, but I tend to avoid that too, because a sharp line there usually looks pretty ugly. But anyway, once we're done painting all these little spots in, making sure everything looks good, we're going to go back over to here to our layer mask. We're going to go up here and switch this to overlay, so that changes the blend mode, so it's not going to be that gray anymore. Now we have a nice sharpened image. I really only do this mostly for posting on Instagram, because Instagram compresses the shit out of everything and it makes it very small and people look at it on tiny screens. So this sort of increases the effect of the sharpness in your photo. Plus for landscapes, you generally want everything in focus anyway, and this sort of helps sell that. So just like before, you're going to select your top layer here, Control-Shift-Alt-E to combine these out to one layer, which I have here, and we're going to deselect our other ones. So now we just have one layer again. I think on this one I went through and sort of removed some distractions. Feel free to do that as you see fit. The new AI remove tool is pretty damn good, so it's very easy to use. So now that we're done with all that, and we have one good layer that's all color graded, it's sharpened, it's pretty much ready to go, we're going to do one more thing, which is the Orton effect. So we're going to, again, take this layer, we're going to duplicate it. So we're going to have two identicals again, but this time we're going to go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. I usually leave this between 20 and 25 for the radius. This is going to create a blur over this top layer. But what we're going to do is we're going to apply this blur only to the bright parts of the image. So we're going to use another luminosity mask. So with our blurry layer selected here, we're going to go back up to brights. We're just going to select one, and instead of hitting make selection, this time we're going to hit apply mask. And this is going to apply that blurry effect only to the brights, but this is very intense. So on our blur layer here, we're just going to go to our opacity, and I usually put it somewhere around 15 and 20%. So we'll just hit it at 18 right there. And now we have a nice, subtle, but beautiful looking glow in our highlights. And that's pretty much it. It's really all it takes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close this one out, and we're going to open a different photo that I took on the same day, and we're just going to go through all the pretty much the same steps just to sort of hammer it into your head if you're still here and you're still paying attention and you still want to learn this stuff. So this one was taken at Blue Hour, so we have our base layer here. We got highlights in the brush area. We've got highlights in the rocks. These are both using luminosity masks and a nice small brush. We've got a glow in the sky. This is not using a luminosity mask. This is just with, I believe it was a colored blue light. We have a little bit more rock and brush glow. We did a separate layer for shadows this time. I'm not really sure why, but it's generally a good idea to do that. We added another layer just to add a little bit more glow in the bottom left-hand side. And then we combined these out and we opened into Adobe Camera Raw and did some color and sky darkening and stuff like that. And then we did a little bit more brightening of the rocks. Not sure what this is, probably a sharpening layer. And then we darkened down the sky a little bit more in a new layer. Did a little bit more glow over here, and then we did the Orton effect. It's really that simple. It's just all about staying organized and using the tools that are available to you to create at least a better image than you would have already had. I'm not saying these images are great or anything, but I do think I made good use of the conditions I had in post-processing. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, be sure to hit me up on Instagram. The link will be in the description, or just leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain anything that might have been confusing. To see another time that I went out and actually created some successful images out in the field, click right here. I don't know what, I mean, why would you put it here? Subscribe, please. Love you guys.